The prisoner keeps talking. His German is rapid, desperate. The words tumble over each other. Kamerad, Kamerad, bitte, please. His hands are raised, fingers spread wide, palms open. The universal gesture. Surrender, safety, quarter. But the Canadian soldier standing before him does not lower his rifle. July 3rd, 1944. 12 kilometers south of Caen, France. The wheat fields stretch golden in the summer heat, and the air smells of cordite and turned earth. The German soldier, no more than 19, his uniform still bearing the insignia of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth, has thrown down his weapon. He has followed every protocol of surrender. He has made himself harmless. The Canadian's finger does not move from the trigger. Behind him, another Canadian soldier approaches. He is older, perhaps 25. There is mud on his boots and dry blood on his sleeve. When he sees the SS insignia on the prisoner's collar, something changes in his face. Not anger. Something colder than anger. He says 3 words in English. Remember deep, boys. The prisoner does not understand English, but he understands the tone. He understands what happens next. This is not the Canada you know from films, not the polite nation of peacekeepers and apologists. This is a force that Wehrmacht commanders learned to fear more than the Americans, more than the British, sometimes more than the Soviets. This is the reputation that German soldiers whispered about in foxholes and wrote about in letters home. The Canadians do not take prisoners. If this story challenges what you thought you knew about World War II, please hit the like button and subscribe. These moments from history deserve to be remembered, even when they make you as uncomfortable. His name was Kurt Meyer, and he made a terrible mistake. Standartenführer, the SS equivalent of colonel, Meyer commanded the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth. Elite troops, fanatical, young men raised in Hitler's Germany, trained to believe they were the master race, convinced they were invincible. On June 7th, 1944, the day after D-Day, Meyer's forces clashed with the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division near the Abbaye d'Ardennes, a medieval monastery that had stood for 800 years. The Canadians were green troops. Many had never seen combat. They fought hard, but they were learning on the job, and they paid for it. Meyer's SS captured dozens of Canadian soldiers that day. Prisoners of war, protected under the Geneva Convention. Men who had surrendered, who had been disarmed, who posed no threat. Kurt Meyer had them shot. Not in the heat of battle, not in confusion or chaos. Systematically, execution style. 20 Canadian prisoners of war murdered in the monastery gardens. Their bodies left where they fell. The Canadians found them 2 days later when they finally took the position. What Kurt Meyer did not understand, what the entire German command structure would not understand until it was far too late, was that the Canadians had very long memories, and that before Normandy, before they ever landed on French soil, there was already a debt to be paid. The debt was cold deep. August 19th, 1942, 2 years before D-Day. The Allied command needed to test German coastal defenses, to learn lessons about amphibious assault before the real invasion. They chose the French port town of Dieppe. They chose to send the Canadians. It was a massacre. Of the 4,963 Canadian soldiers who went ashore that morning, only 2,400 returned. In 9 hours of fighting, 1,005 Canadian were killed. 1,946 were captured. The beaches were so thick with Canadian dead that the water ran red. German machine gunners said afterward they did not need to aim. They could not miss. But the killing did not stop when Canadians surrendered. German forces, particularly the SS unit stationed at Dieppe, did not treat Canadian prisoners with the formality that the Geneva Convention required. There were beatings. There were summary executions of wounded men. There were war crimes that German commanders justified by saying the Canadians had raided German-held territory, that they were commandos, not regular soldiers, that they deserved what they got. The Canadians who survived Dieppe went into prisoner war camps. But the Canadians who heard about Dieppe, the ones still in England, training for the invasion they knew would come, they absorbed the lesson. When the SS murders prisoners, the SS should not expect to become prisoners. After the massacre at Abbaye d'Ardennes, after the discovery of those 20 executed Canadians in the monastery garden, the orders that circulated through Canadian units were never written down. They were spoken quietly, passed from sergeant to corporal to private. The kind of orders that do not appear in official histories. SS prisoners are not to be escorted to the rear. They are to be dealt with in the field. In the war crimes trials after Germany's surrender, Kurt Meyer would be convicted of murdering Canadian prisoners. He would serve 9 years in prison before his release. But his sentence, in a way, was mercy, because for 2 years after the Abbaye-Dieudonne massacre, any SS soldier who fell into Canadian hands rarely lived long enough to see a trial. The Germans noticed. The letters started appearing in 1944. German soldiers wrote home to wives, to mothers, to sweethearts. The letters passed through military censors, who noted the patterns. Wehrmacht intelligence officers compiled reports. And what emerged was something the German High Command had not expected: a reputation. The Canadians were different. Not less skilled than the British, German after-action reports noted that Canadian tactical planning and execution matched their British counterparts almost exactly. Not less brave than the Americans, Canadian units advanced with the same aggressive spirit that characterized United States forces. But something else. Something that combined British professionalism with American aggression and added one more element: personal hatred. One German soldier, serving with the 346th Infantry Division in Normandy, wrote to his wife in July 1944, "The Canadians are the worst, even worse than the Tommies. They do not take prisoners. Everyone knows this. When you see the maple leaf, you know you will not surrender. You will fight or you will die." Another letter, intercepted by Allied intelligence, was more specific. "The SS boys are terrified of the Canadians. They say the Canadians remember deep. They say the Canadians have a list. I do not know if this is true. I do know that Oberscharführer Schmidt was captured by Canadians 3 days ago. No one has heard from him. No one expects to." Wehrmacht intelligence report from August 1944 noted the phenomenon with clinical precision. Canadian forces demonstrate high level of tactical competence combined with unusual degree of aggression toward Waffen-SS units. Recommend avoiding engagement with Canadian formations when possible. Recommend SS units specifically avoid capture by Canadian forces. Recommend avoiding the Canadians. This from the army that had conquered France in 6 weeks, that had pushed to the gates of Moscow, that had built an empire from Norway to North Africa. They were recommending their soldiers avoid the Canadians. But the Canadians were everywhere. June 6, 1944. D-Day. Juno Beach. 5 beaches. 5 landing zones. The Americans took Utah and Omaha. The British took Golden Sword. The Canadians took Juno. Every history of D-Day mentions Omaha Beach. The bloodiest landing. The longest day. 4,000 casualties. American heroism against impossible odds. And Omaha was hell. This is not in dispute. But here is what those histories mention less frequently. By the end of D-Day, the Canadians had advanced further inland than any other Allied force. 9 kilometers. Farther than the Americans at Omaha. Farther than the British at Sword. The Canadians were supposed to link up with British forces at Koren on D-Day itself. They did not make it, but they came closer than anyone else. The Germans defending Juno Beach learned something that day. Something they would report back to their commanders, who would report it up the chain until it reached Wehrmacht headquarters and became part of the growing file on Canadian combat effectiveness. The Canadians do not slow down. When the Americans bogged down at Omaha, they established a beachhead and consolidated. When the British faced resistance at Sword, they regrouped and planned. Standard military doctrine. Sensible tactics. The Canadians simply kept moving forward. A German lieutenant, captured at Courcelles-sur-Mer on the evening of June 6, told his interrogators, "They came off the beach and they did not stop. We hit them with machine gun fire, with mortars, with everything we had. Some fell. The rest kept coming. We fell back to secondary positions. They followed. We established a defense line. They broke through. In my 5 years of military service, I have never seen such aggression." This was not recklessness. Canadian casualties on D-Day were actually lower than American or British losses. This was calculated violence. Professional violence. Violence with a purpose. And for the SS units in Normandy, the ones who had been at deep, the ones who had murdered Canadian prisoners at Abbaye-Dieudonne, the ones who thought the Canadians were soft, It was the violence of a bill coming due. The problem for the Germans was tactical. When you are losing a war, when you are in retreat, when your lines are collapsing and your supplies are cut and your forces are surrounded, you have two options. You can fight to the death, which is dramatic but ultimately pointless. Or you can surrender, which at least means you survive the war. But surrender only works if the other side is willing to accept your surrender. By July 1944, German soldiers in Normandy knew that surrendering to the British usually meant capture, interrogation, and transport to a prisoner of war camp. Unpleasant, but survivable. Surrendering to the Americans meant roughly the same thing, though the Americans were known to be less formal about the process. Surrendering to the Canadians, especially if you were SS, meant something different entirely. Wehrmacht reports from the Normandy campaign note the phenomenon repeatedly. German units, when surrounded, specifically attempted to maneuver toward British or American positions rather than Canadian ones. When forces surrendered to Canadian forces, regular Wehrmacht soldiers were usually treated according to Geneva Convention standards. But SS soldiers, particularly those from units that had been involved in the Deep Raid or the Abbaye d'Ardennes massacre, frequently did not survive capture. The killings were rarely witnessed by outsiders. They happened in fields, in forests, in bombed-out buildings, away from journalists, away from officers who might file reports. A captured SS soldier will be marched away from the front lines, supposedly to a collection point for prisoners, and he would not arrive. Canadian soldiers did not discuss this. Not then, not in official channels. For decades after the war, Canadian veterans maintained the same public image, polite, professional, by the book. The liberation of Holland would cement this reputation. Canadians as the good guys, the liberators, the heroes. But the Germans who fought against the Canadians remembered something different. August 1944. The Falaise Gap. The German army in Normandy was trapped, surrounded by American, British, and Canadian forces. A pocket, narrowing every day. The only escape route was through a gap near the town of Falaise. 50,000 German soldiers tried to force their way through. 20,000 did not make it. The Canadians controlled the northern edge of the gap. German survivors later reported that units specifically avoided the Canadian sector. Even under artillery fire, even under air attack, German forces tried to break through anywhere except where the Canadians were. This made no tactical sense. The Canadian positions were no stronger than British or American ones. But the Germans knew. They had heard the stories. They knew what happened to SS prisoners. One German corporal, who survived the Falaise Gap and was captured by American forces 2 weeks later, told interrogators, "We were told to avoid the Canadians at all costs." Even the officers said this. They did not say why. They did not need to. Everyone knew. The Canadians had a reputation. The SS were especially afraid. Some SS men tore off their insignia before trying to surrender. Some tried to pass as regular Wehrmacht. It did not always work. The Canadians could tell. They always could. The interrogator asked him, how could they tell? The corporal said, "I do not know, but they knew, and when they knew, those men did not come back." After the war, historians would count prisoners taken during the Normandy campaign. The Americans captured approximately 68,000 German soldiers. The British captured approximately 93,000. The Canadians, despite being a smaller force that faced equivalent resistance and took equivalent ground, captured approximately 41,000. The numbers tell a story. It is not the story that appears in official histories, but it is the story the Germans remembered. But here is the paradox. The Canadian military conducted very few war crimes investigations into its own troops. This was not unusual. The Americans and British also rarely prosecuted their own soldiers for crimes against German prisoners. But in the Canadian case, the absence of investigations is notable because the German reports and testimony are so consistent. The pattern is too clear to be coincidence. So what do we call this? Not official policy, because it was not written down or formally ordered. Not individual aberration, because it was too widespread and too systematic. Perhaps the closest term is collective understanding, a shared belief, passed through informal channels, that certain crimes demanded certain responses, that the SS had forfeited their right to be treated as soldiers when they murdered prisoners, that justice, in this case, could not wait for war crimes trials that might never happen. Is this morally defensible? The question has no easy answer. On one hand, the Geneva Convention exists for a reason. Soldiers who surrender are no longer combatants. They have rights. Even SS soldiers, even war criminals, deserve trials rather than field executions. The moment you abandon these principles, even for good reasons, you risk becoming what you are fighting against. On the other hand, what do you do when the enemy systematically violates every rule of war? When they murder your prisoners, execute your wounded, treat surrender as an opportunity for massacre? Do you continue to follow rules that the other side ignores? Do you trust that justice will be served later, when the war is over, when tribunals convene and evidence is gathered? The Canadians, apparently, decided they could not wait. They decided that the SS had made their choice at Dieppe, at Abbaye d'Ardennes, at a dozen other places where Canadian prisoners were murdered. And they decided that the response would be immediate, not postponed to some theoretical future trial. Was this justice or vengeance? The Germans certainly saw it as vengeance. But then, the Germans had started the cycle. They had set the precedent. And in the moral calculus of total war, perhaps the Canadians concluded that allowing SS soldiers to survive and stand trial was mercy they had not earned. We will never know what individual Canadian soldiers thought in those moments. Whether they struggled with the decision, whether they felt guilt afterward, whether they believed they were doing the right thing or just doing what they had to do. What we know is what they did, and we know that the Germans noticed. In 2007, the Canadian government officially apologized for the Dieppe raid. Not for the raid itself, that was an Allied decision, not purely Canadian, but for the way Dieppe veterans were treated after the war. Many came home with physical and psychological trauma. Many were never fully recognized for what they had endured. The apology acknowledged that these soldiers had paid a terrible price and had not received the support they deserved. The apology did not mention what came after Dieppe, what those soldiers, and the soldiers who followed them, did with their memories of French beaches running red with Canadian blood, what conclusions they drew about the SS and what the SS deserved. Perhaps some things are better left unsaid. But history has a way of preserving what official narratives omit. The German reports exist. The testimony of Wehrmacht veterans exists. The statistics on prisoners taken exist. And together, they tell a story that Canada has never fully acknowledged. The Canadians were not the gentle peacekeepers of popular imagination. Not in World War II. Not when they were fighting the SS. They were professional soldiers who fought with skill and courage and discipline. But they also fought with something else. A kind of moral certainty. A conviction that certain crimes demanded immediate response. A willingness to be the instrument of that response. The Germans feared them for good reason. Today, when you visit the Canadian war cemeteries in France and Holland, you will find immaculate grounds. White crosses in perfect rows. Flowers placed by Dutch families who still remember the liberation. Tall guides who speak of Canadian heroism and sacrifice. And it is all true, every word. But walk those rows of crosses and consider, what did these men do? Not just the official acts, the battles won, the ground taken, but the unofficial acts, the moments in fields and forests, the SS prisoners who disappeared, the debts paid in blood. History is uncomfortable when it is honest. The Canadians who fought in World War II were heroes. This is not in question. They liberated Holland. They played a crucial role in the defeat of Nazi Germany. They fought for freedom and democracy against totalitarian evil. But they were also human. And humans, when pushed far enough, when they have seen enough brutality, when they have watched their friends die, humans can decide that mercy has limits, that some crimes are unforgivable, that justice cannot always wait for courts and judges. The Germans who fought them understood this. They understood that the Canadians were not sadists or monsters. They were soldiers who had drawn a line, who had decided that the SS had crossed that line at Dieppe, who had determined that certain debts would be paid one way or another. Was this right? Was this necessary? Was this justice? Perhaps the only honest answer is, it was war. And in war, the gap between justice and vengeance becomes very narrow indeed. The Canadians chose to cross that gap, to be the force that the SS feared, to be the soldiers who did not forget and did not forgive. History has softened this reputation. Popular culture has replaced it with maple syrup and hockey and politeness. But the German veterans remember. And the records, if you know where to look, tell the truth. The Canadians were the soldiers they feared most, not because they were more brutal than other Allied forces, but because they remembered, because they had learned at deep what the SS was capable of, and because they had decided, collectively and individually, that when they finally got their chance, when the SS who had murdered Canadian prisoners finally fell into Canadian hands, there would be a reckoning. The Germans called it Canadian vengeance. The Canadians called it justice. Perhaps both are true. The debt was paid. The Canadians made certain of that. And when the war ended, when they came home to quiet farms and small towns, when they put away their uniforms and returned to being polite Canadians, they did not talk about it. They did not need to. The Germans had already spread the word. If this story revealed a side of history you had never heard, please share this video. These moments matter, even when, especially when, they complicate our understanding of heroism and justice. The truth is rarely simple, but it is always worth knowing.